At just 15 years old, Emily Carter stood on the side of a coastal road with nothing but a worn backpack and the last $100 her late father had secretly left for her after her stepmother threw her out of the only home she'd ever known. Most people would have spent that money on food or a cheap motel. Emily spent every single dollar buying an abandoned Coast Guard shack that everyone in town said was nothing more than a rotten pile of wood waiting to collapse. The auctioneer laughed. The crowd shook their heads. Some even whispered that the poor girl had finally lost her mind. But 3 weeks later, while replacing a section of the old floor, her hammer struck something that didn't sound like wood. Beneath the planks was a hidden metal hatch no town record had ever mentioned. When Emily forced it open and climbed into the darkness, she stepped into a forgotten that had been sealed for decades. And what she discovered there would change everything people believed about her father. Before we uncover what was hidden behind that locked door, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Leave a comment so I can say hello. And if you're enjoying stories about forgotten legacies, hidden family secrets, and unbelievable true-to-life mysteries, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story, wherever you are. I hope you're having a wonderful day. The rain had not stopped since dawn, as if the gray sky itself had decided there was no reason to celebrate the end of Emily Carter's childhood. She stood quietly beside the freshly covered grave of her father, clutching the worn backpack that contained everything she still owned. At 15 years old, she had already learned that silence could hurt more than shouting. The pastor offered a few gentle words before people drifted away in small groups, speaking in hushed voices that always seemed to stop whenever Emily looked their way. Some remembered her father as a quiet Coast Guard radio operator. Others remembered only the rumors that followed the terrible storm decades earlier. No one came over to comfort her. Within minutes, the cemetery was nearly empty. Linda Carter waited impatiently beside her pickup truck, tapping her fingers against the steering wheel. "Are you coming?" she called without looking at Emily. The drive home lasted less than 20 minutes, but neither of them spoke. The old white house overlooking the harbor no longer felt familiar. The moment they stepped inside, Linda walked directly into the living room and placed a small envelope on the coffee table. "Your father left this for you," she said flatly. $100? That's all? Emily stared at the envelope without touching it. "He said you'd know what to do with it someday." Linda folded her arms. "Well, someday is today." Emily finally picked it up. Inside were 5 crisp $20 bills and a tiny handwritten note in her father's careful script. "For emergencies, make good choices. I believe in you." Her vision blurred before she quickly folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. Linda disappeared upstairs. A few minutes later, she returned carrying Emily's backpack, already packed. "What's this?" Emily whispered. "You're leaving?" Emily froze. I live here." "Not anymore. Dad wouldn't have wanted this." Linda's expression hardened. "Your father is gone, and I can't afford another mouth to feed. I can work. You're 15. I'll find something. This isn't a discussion." Linda opened the front door. A cool wind swept inside, carrying the smell of salt water and distant fishing boats. "Take your bag and go." Emily stood motionless. "Please." Linda looked away instead of meeting her eyes. "I'm selling the house. I need a clean start." Emily swallowed hard. She wanted to argue, to scream, to remind Linda of birthdays, Christmas dinners, family photographs that suddenly seemed meaningless. Instead, she quietly picked up her backpack. The front door closed behind her with a dull click that echoed louder than any slam. She remained on the porch for several seconds before walking toward the harbor. By late afternoon, she had wandered through nearly every street in the small coastal town. She counted her money twice, even though she already knew the amount. $100. Enough for a few nights in a motel if she was careful. Enough for groceries. Not enough to change her life. As the sun lowered behind the docks, Emily sat on a weathered bench overlooking the marina. Fishing boats rocked gently against their ropes while seagulls circled overhead. She watched families laughing together on the boardwalk and suddenly felt invisible. An elderly fisherman sat beside her with a newspaper tucked beneath his arm. He noticed her backpack and tired eyes. "You looking for work?" he asked kindly. Emily nodded. "Anything?" He sighed. "Not much hiring this late in the season." As he unfolded the newspaper, a small advertisement caught Emily's attention. "County Surplus Auction Saturday, Old Coast Guard Shack, sold as is." The tiny photograph showed a weather-beaten wooden building standing alone near the rocky shoreline outside town. Something about it stirred a distant memory. She remembered waiting there as a little girl while her father finished late shifts. She remembered the smell of coffee, old radios, and damp wooden floors. "Do you know that place?" she asked. The fisherman glanced down. "That old shack?" he chuckled. "Been abandoned for years. Roof leaks, foundations probably rotten." "Why are they selling it?" "No use keeping it. It'll likely be torn down." Emily thanked him and folded the newspaper clipping into her pocket. The next morning, she walked nearly 5 miles to the auction site. About 20 people stood around drinking coffee while laughing about the worthless building. The faded Coast Guard sign leaned sideways, barely attached to the wall. Windows were cracked, paint peeled from every surface. Grass had grown through broken steps leading to the porch. The auctioneer began with equipment before finally pointing toward the shack. "Who'll give me $100? Silence. 90. Still nothing. Emily felt every eye drifting toward the lonely building. Her fingers tightened around the envelope inside her pocket. It wasn't just an abandoned shack. It was the last place where she had seen her father smile while wearing his Coast Guard jacket. She slowly raised her hand. 100. The crowd turned. Someone laughed. Another man shook his hand. "Kids buying firewood," one woman muttered. Even the auctioneer looked surprised. 100, going once, going twice, sold. Several people chuckled as Emily accepted the old brass key attached to a faded tag. The auctioneer offered an awkward smile that couldn't hide his disbelief. "Good luck, miss." Emily simply nodded. She walked alone toward the tiny shack overlooking the restless Atlantic. By sunset, she had swept enough debris from one corner to unroll her sleeping bag. The wind rattled loose window frames while waves crashed against nearby rocks. Despite everything, it was the first place that felt even slightly like home since her father died. Long after darkness settled over the coast, she lay awake, listening to the building creak with every gust. Then, somewhere beneath the wooden floorboards, came a sharp, metallic clang unlike anything the wind could make. Emily slowly sat upright, holding her breath as the strange sound echoed once more from somewhere below her feet. Morning arrived beneath a blanket of gray clouds, and the steady sound of waves crashing against the rocks woke Emily before the sun had fully risen. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the cold air drifting through the cracked windows reminded her that this abandoned Coast Guard shack was now the only place she could call home. She pulled her sleeping bag aside and glanced at the loose floorboards where she had heard the strange, metallic sound during the night. Everything looked ordinary again. She crouched and tapped one plank with her knuckles. Hollow. The next one sounded solid. She listened carefully, but nothing answered except the wind outside. "Probably just the building settling," she whispered, trying to convince herself. Hunger quickly became a more immediate problem. She counted the few coins left in her pocket after buying the shack. Barely enough for a loaf of bread and a bottle of water. Every dollar mattered now. So instead of buying supplies to repair the building, she decided to make use of whatever had been left behind. She spent the morning opening warped cabinets, clearing piles of damp newspapers, and dragging broken chairs outside. The shack smelled of mildew, salt, and old wood that had absorbed decades of ocean air. Dust coated every shelf. Rust covered nearly every nail. Yet beneath the neglect, she noticed signs that the building had once been cared for. Someone had built sturdy shelves by hand. Hooks for heavy raincoats still lined one wall. Faded labels marked storage lockers that had long since been emptied. Near the back window, she discovered an old, framed photograph lying face down beneath a collapsed cabinet. She carefully wiped away the dirt with her sleeve. The glass was cracked, but the picture remained clear enough to recognize several Coast Guard crew members standing proudly in front of the shack many years earlier. Her heart skipped when she spotted her father near the center of the group, smiling in the same quiet way she remembered from childhood. He looked much younger, wearing his Coast Guard jacket with the station behind him looking almost new. Emily smiled for the first time in days. She set the photograph against the wall where she could see it while she worked. Around noon, she carried another load of broken lumber outside. A pickup truck rolled slowly onto the gravel road before stopping beside the shack. An elderly man stepped out, his weathered face shaded by a faded fishing cap. Emily recognized him immediately. He was the fisherman who had shown her the auction notice. "Thought I might find you here," he said. "Name's Jack Holloway." "Emily," he nodded. "I know who you are." There was no judgment in his voice, only quiet understanding. His eyes wandered across the piles of rotten boards stacked outside. "You've already done more cleaning than the county managed in 10 years. Emily gave a small laugh. "It doesn't look like much. Everything starts looking like something after enough work." Jack reached into the bed of his truck and pulled out a small toolbox along with a dented metal kettle. "Figured you could use these more than I can." Emily hesitated. "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to." He placed the items on the porch. "Just don't waste them." She thanked him sincerely. The toolbox contained a hammer, screwdriver, pry bar, tape measure, and several handfuls of old nails sorted into glass jars. They were worn, but usable. To Emily, they looked more valuable than anything she had owned in months. Jack stepped inside the shack, studying the empty rooms with thoughtful eyes. "Haven't been in here for a long time." "Did you know my father?" she asked quietly. He remained silent for several seconds before answering. "Worked with him now and then. Good man." Emily looked at the photograph. "People don't seem to remember him that way." Jack sighed, but didn't argue. Instead, he walked toward the center of the room and rested one boot on the wooden floor. "Whatever folks remember, your father cared about this place." His expression suddenly became serious. "One piece of advice." Emily looked up. "Don't dig too deep around here." She frowned. "Why?" Jack glanced toward the floorboards before looking back at her. "Some old buildings are better left standing than taken apart." "Is the foundation unsafe?" "Just be careful." Before she could ask another question, he tipped his cap. "I'll stop by again sometime." Emily watched him drive away, puzzled by the warning. It wasn't fear she had seen in his eyes. It was hesitation, as though he had nearly said something he wasn't ready to share. The afternoon passed with steady work. She repaired one broken window using scraps of plywood and swept decades of dirt from the main room while clearing debris beneath a small storage shelf near the rear wall. Her broom struck something metallic hidden under layers of dust. She knelt and brushed away the dirt until a small brass key appeared in her hand. Time had darkened its surface green in places, but its teeth remained intact. A tiny oval tag still hung from the ring, though years of corrosion had erased whatever number had once been stamped into it. Emily smiled hopefully. Maybe you still belong somewhere. She spent nearly an hour trying the key in every lock she could find: the front door, old cabinets, a rusted locker near the entrance, even a small wooden chest missing its lid. None of them fit. The key seemed to belong to nothing inside the shack. Rather than throw it aside, she slipped it into her pocket beside her father's note. If someone had hidden it beneath the shelf, there had to be a reason. Late that afternoon, she returned to the framed photograph. This time, she looked more closely. Her father stood near the center, but something caught her attention in the background, just inside the open doorway behind the group. She could make out part of a room filled with radio equipment. She looked around the shack. There was no such room anymore. Either it had been removed during renovations years ago, or it had been sealed away somehow. Before she could think further, a loud crack echoed beneath her feet. One of the old floorboards near the back wall suddenly split under her weight. Emily stumbled backward as rotten wood gave way, revealing a narrow opening below. Kneeling carefully, she brushed aside broken planks until the shape became unmistakable. Hidden beneath the floor was the top of an old wooden staircase descending into darkness, its entrance tightly sealed for decades until time had finally broken it open. Emily remained frozen beside the broken floorboards, staring into the narrow opening that had appeared beneath her feet. A faint breath of cool, stale air drifted upward from the darkness below, carrying the unmistakable smell of rust, damp concrete, and something much older than the abandoned shack itself. For several long seconds, she simply listened. The building creaked softly in the ocean wind. Waves crashed against the rocks outside. Nothing moved beneath the floor. She knelt carefully beside the opening and brushed away more splintered wood. Hidden under decades of dust was a wooden hatch reinforced with iron straps. Time had warped the boards, leaving a gap wide enough for her to see the top few steps of a staircase descending into complete darkness. Someone had clearly intended to keep this entrance sealed. Emily reached for the old pry bar Jack had given her. The iron hinges protested with a sharp groan before finally giving way. Dust burst into the room, making her cough. She waited until the air settled before widening the opening enough to climb through. The staircase looked sturdy despite its age. Holding the flashlight she had found inside the toolbox, she tested each step before placing her weight on it. Every board creaked beneath her shoes, echoing through the hidden space below. At the bottom, she found herself standing inside a surprisingly large room built beneath the shack. Concrete walls surrounded the space, still solid despite years of neglect. Thick pipes disappeared into the ceiling. Shelves lined one side of the room, their contents hidden beneath heavy gray canvas that had collected decades of dust. The beam from her flashlight swept slowly across the room until it stopped on a row of old radio equipment. Large transmitters, metal control panels, microphones, and tangled wires sat exactly where someone had left them many years before. Emily's heartbeat quickened. This had to be the radio room visible in the old photograph. Nothing here looked destroyed. It looked abandoned in a hurry. She stepped farther inside. Dust covered every surface, but almost nothing appeared stolen. Headphones still hung from a hook beside a microphone. A faded calendar remained pinned to the wall, frozen on the same month from decades ago. Empty coffee mugs rested beside stacks of weathered manuals. It felt less like entering an abandoned building and more like walking into a room whose occupants had expected to return the next morning. Emily gently lifted one edge of the dusty canvas covering the largest radio console. The Coast Guard emblem remained visible beneath years of grime. She imagined her father sitting here, listening to voices carried across the ocean, answering frightened fishermen during storms. The thought made the room feel strangely alive despite its silence. She continued exploring slowly, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. Against one wall stood several metal filing cabinets. Most drawers refused to open after years of rust, but one slid outward with a loud scrape. Inside, she found stacks of water-damaged maintenance reports, supply lists, weather observations, and old duty schedules. She leafed through a few pages before setting them aside. They seemed ordinary, yet their dates stretched back farther than she expected. Near the center of the room sat a sturdy wooden desk. Unlike everything else, it had been covered with a waterproof cloth that preserved much of its surface. Emily folded the cloth aside and discovered a thick black notebook resting neatly in the middle of the desk. The cover read simply, "Station Log." Her hands trembled as she opened it. The first pages contained neat handwritten entries recording weather conditions, incoming radio traffic, equipment inspections, and rescue operations. Different handwriting appeared throughout the notebook, showing that several operators had contributed over the years. Emily turned page after page, fascinated by the ordinary rhythm of daily life that had once filled this hidden room. The entries gradually became fewer, until only one familiar style of handwriting remained. She immediately recognized it from the note her father had left with the $100. The careful letters matched perfectly. She sat quietly in the old chair and began reading his final entries. They described worsening weather offshore, reports of rising winds, radio checks with nearby vessels, and growing concern as a powerful storm approached the coastline. There was no panic in his writing, only steady professionalism. Emily smiled sadly. Even on paper, her father sounded calm. She continued reading until her expression slowly changed. Several consecutive pages had been violently torn from the notebook. Jagged strips remained attached to the binding where someone had ripped them out years ago. She carefully searched the desk for the missing pages but found nothing. Why remove only those entries? Everything before and after remained untouched. She examined the torn edges again. This had not happened accidentally. Someone had deliberately removed that part of the record. Emily closed the notebook for a moment, trying to make sense of what she had found. Jack's warning echoed in her mind. Don't dig too deep around here. Had he known this room existed? Had others known as well? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. She rose from the desk and explored the remaining shelves. Most contained spare radio parts, batteries that had long since corroded, coils of heavy cable, and sealed metal containers marked with faded inventory numbers. Nothing seemed valuable in the ordinary sense, yet everything carried the weight of forgotten history. As she turned back toward the desk, her flashlight reflected off a small brass nameplate mounted near the edge. She wiped away the dust with her sleeve. Beneath it were engraved words she instantly recognized. Senior Radio Operator Thomas Carter. She reached out and rested her fingertips gently on her father's name. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they came with something she had not felt since his funeral. Pride. Whatever had happened here, he had belonged in this room. She returned to the station log one last time before leaving. As she closed the notebook, a folded sheet of paper slipped from between the final pages and drifted onto the desk. It looked newer than everything else, protected from moisture inside the journal. Emily unfolded it carefully. There was only one handwritten sentence across the page, written in the same familiar handwriting she had already recognized. If anyone finds this room, tell Emily the truth. Emily read the sentence again, slower this time, as though the words might change if she stared at them long enough. If anyone finds this room, tell Emily the truth. She traced the familiar handwriting with her fingertips before carefully folding the page and slipping it inside her backpack beside her father's final note. 2 messages, both written by the same steady hand. One had prepared her for surviving after he was gone. The other suggested he had expected someone to discover this hidden room someday. But who had he expected to tell her the truth? The room offered no answer. She looked around one last time before climbing the staircase as the hatch closed above her. The quiet darkness swallowed the old radio room once again. Emily stood in the empty shack for several minutes, trying to decide what to do next. She could not keep the discovery to herself forever. If the station log and the hidden room mattered enough for someone to seal them away, there had to be official records somewhere that explained what had happened. By mid-morning, she locked the shack and began the long walk into town. The public library occupied one of the oldest brick buildings near the harbor. It was small, quiet, and nearly empty when she stepped inside. Shelves filled with local history surrounded a wooden front desk where a woman in her 30s sorted returned books. She looked up with a welcoming smile. "Can I help you?" Emily hesitated before answering. "I'm looking for old Coast Guard records." The librarian introduced herself as Nora Benson. "Research project." Emily considered lying, then decided against it. "I'm trying to learn about my father, Thomas Carter." Nora's expression softened slightly. "I remember hearing that name." She motioned toward a reading table. "Let's see what we can find." Together they searched shelves containing bound newspapers, maritime reports, and local historical indexes. Nora showed Emily how to use the library's archive catalog, then disappeared into a storage room before returning with several thick boxes labeled Harbor Records. Dust floated through the sunlight as they opened the first container. Most documents listed routine harbor maintenance, fishing permits, and weather observations. Emily patiently sorted through stack after stack while Nora searched nearby filing cabinets. Hours passed before Nora finally carried over a thin folder. "This might be what you're looking for." Inside were newspaper clippings describing a violent coastal storm many years earlier. Several fishing boats had been caught offshore after weather conditions changed unexpectedly. The articles praised local rescue crews for saving numerous lives, but one short paragraph near the bottom mentioned that Coast Guard radio communications had experienced unexplained delays during the emergency. Thomas Carter's name appeared only once. According to the official report, he had remained at the old station longer than instructed, slowing coordination during the rescue. Emily stared at the sentence. It didn't match what she had read in the station log. Her father's final entries showed him calmly tracking incoming distress calls before several pages had been torn away. "Something's wrong," she whispered. Nora looked up. "What do you mean?" Emily carefully chose her words. "The records don't seem complete." Nora leaned closer. "Official reports aren't always the same as personal records." Emily met her eyes. "What if important pages disappeared?" Nora remained quiet for a moment before answering. "Then you'd need more than newspaper articles." She stood and walked toward another shelf containing oversized binders. "The library also keeps copies of old harbor maps and emergency response files whenever they're donated." Emily helped carry the heavy binders to the table. Many contained handwritten annotations from retired harbor officials. Most had nothing to do with the old shack. Then Nora paused while turning one large page. "Here!" Folded inside the binder was a faded coastal chart marked with shipping lanes, rocky shoals, and emergency navigation routes. One area offshore had been circled in red pencil. A handwritten note nearby simply read, "Final signal received." Emily recognized the handwriting immediately. It matched her father's. Her pulse quickened. The map showed a location several miles from shore where one of the fishing boats had apparently transmitted its last distress call. Yet the official newspaper article never mentioned this marked position. Instead, it described a completely different rescue timeline. Emily carefully compared the map with the newspaper. The two versions contradicted each other. Before she could ask Nora another question, a firm voice interrupted from behind. "Library archives aren't supposed to leave these tables." Emily turned to see a uniformed deputy standing nearby. His badge identified him as Ryan Mills. He wasn't hostile, but his expression carried the cautious professionalism of someone responding to an unusual situation. Nora smiled politely. "She's only researching local history." Ryan looked toward the documents spread across the table. "I've had a call about someone entering the old Coast Guard property." Emily felt her stomach tighten. "I bought that building at the county auction." "I know," Ryan nodded. "County records confirmed the sale." His eyes moved briefly over the weathered newspaper clippings. "Still, some of these historical files are restricted until they're processed." Emily quickly gathered the papers into neat stacks. "I wasn't trying to take anything." "I didn't say you were." Ryan's tone softened slightly. "Just be careful with archived material. Some originals are fragile." Nora stepped in gently. "Everything stays here." Ryan accepted the explanation with a small nod. "Good." Before leaving, he glanced toward Emily once more. "If you find anything unusual inside that old shack, let the county know. Old government buildings sometimes contain hazardous materials." Emily thanked him quietly, though she noticed he never asked exactly what she had found. After the deputy left, silence returned to the reading room. Emily unfolded the harbor map once more, near the edge of the paper. Almost hidden beneath years of fading, her father had drawn a thin pencil line extending from the marked rescue location toward the shoreline. It ended at a tiny hand-drawn circle positioned directly beneath the abandoned Coast Guard shack. Emily walked back to the Coast Guard shack with the folded harbor map tucked safely inside her backpack. The afternoon sky had darkened, and a cool breeze swept in from the Atlantic, carrying the familiar scent of salt and seaweed. Every few minutes, she reached back to make sure the station log, the loose page from her father, and the map were still there. They were beginning to feel less like old papers and more like pieces of a puzzle someone had intentionally scattered. When she reached the shack, she unlocked the door and immediately climbed down into the hidden radio room. The stale air greeted her once again. This time, however, she no longer felt like an intruder. She felt like she was following footsteps her father had expected someone to retrace. She spread the harbor map across the wooden desk beneath the old station log. The pencil line ending beneath the shack still puzzled her. If her father had drawn it, he had wanted someone to connect the offshore rescue location with this very room. She examined the radio equipment again, paying closer attention to details she had overlooked before. Dust covered every switch and dial. Several cables had been disconnected, while others remained attached exactly as they had been left. The largest transmitter occupied the center of the room, surrounded by heavy metal cabinets filled with aging electrical components. None of it had power anymore. Emily remembered the small toolbox Jack had given her. She climbed upstairs, retrieved it, and carried it back into the radio room. Although she knew almost nothing about radio equipment, she understood basic wiring well enough from helping her father repair things around the house when she was younger. He had always insisted that machines deserved patience before force. She removed the rear panel from one of the electrical cabinets. Inside, years of dust coated everything, but the wiring itself appeared surprisingly intact. A thick power cable disappeared through a conduit running toward the back wall. Following it, she discovered an old breaker panel mounted beside the entrance. Several switches had been deliberately turned off. One fuse had burned out long ago. Emily searched the storage shelves until she found a small box labeled "Replacement Fuses." Most had corroded beyond use, but one remained sealed inside its original paper wrapper. She carefully installed it before returning to the breaker panel. Her heart raced as she pushed the first switch upward. Nothing happened. She tried another. Still nothing. Finally, on the third switch, a faint mechanical click echoed through the room. A small green indicator light flickered weakly on the side of one control cabinet before fading again. Emily smiled, despite herself. At least part of the system was still alive. She continued checking loose connections, tightening screws where corrosion had loosened them. Nearly an hour passed before she gathered enough confidence to press the main power button on the central radio console. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, with a low electrical hum, a row of tiny amber lights blinked to life. The sound startled her enough that she stepped backward. The ancient equipment vibrated gently, as if waking from a very long sleep. Most of the displays remained dark, but one analog meter slowly lifted from 0 before settling again. Emily leaned closer. Static crackled softly through an old speaker. She adjusted one knob. The static grew louder. Another switch produced only silence. Then she noticed a small reel-to-reel tape recorder built into the console. A single tape remained threaded through its spools. Dust covered the clear plastic reels, but the tape itself appeared undamaged. She hesitated before pressing the play button. At first, only static filled the room. Then a burst of distorted voices emerged beneath the crackling interference. Copy. Repeat. Visibility dropping. Another voice answered, broken by static. Receiving weak signal. Emily leaned closer until she almost forgot to breathe. The recording continued with fragments of radio traffic exchanged during what sounded like a rescue operation. Weather reports, vessel names, coordinates. Everything matched the kind of entries she had seen inside the station log. Suddenly, another voice came through the speaker. Calm, clear, familiar in a way she couldn't explain until the realization struck her. It was her father's voice. Emily closed her eyes as tears gathered almost instantly. She had not heard him speak since before his funeral. Years had passed, yet his voice sounded exactly as she remembered. Steady, reassuring, never hurried. Harbor Command, this is Station 12, he said through bursts of static. Receiving distress call from the North Channel. Signal weak but readable. More static interrupted him. Another operator responded. The conversation continued for several minutes, filled with coordinates and rescue instructions. Emily listened carefully, afraid to miss even a single word. Her father's voice remained calm, despite reports of worsening weather. At one point, he repeated a set of coordinates twice before acknowledging another incoming transmission. Everything she heard suggested an organized rescue effort. Nothing matched the newspaper article accusing him of delaying communications. The recording advanced toward what seemed to be the most critical moment. Wind howled across the microphone. Voices became more urgent. Someone shouted that another vessel had entered dangerous waters. Her father answered immediately. Hold your course. I'm still receiving your signal. Emily leaned even closer to the speaker. Then, without warning, the tape lurched. A loud mechanical click echoed through the recorder. The voices disappeared. Several inches of magnetic tape had been cleanly removed. The reels continued turning silently until the recording resumed much later, with only routine maintenance chatter recorded days afterward. Emily stared at the spinning reels in disbelief. The most important portion of the recording, the very moment that might explain everything, was gone. She stopped the machine and gently rewound the tape, hoping it had merely skipped. It hadn't. The missing section had been physically cut away with remarkable precision. Someone had deliberately removed part of the original recording. She rested both hands on the desk, trying to steady herself. First, the station log had missing pages. Now the audio record had been altered as well. Whatever had happened during that storm, someone had erased it. more than once. The room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of the tape recorder, winding to a stop. Emily looked toward the old radio console, realizing that the missing voices hidden inside that cut section might be the very truth her father had hoped she would one day discover. Emily barely slept that night. The sound of her father's voice echoed through her thoughts long after the tape recorder had fallen silent. Again and again she replayed the moment when the recording abruptly jumped forward, leaving behind only empty seconds where the most important conversation should have been. Someone had removed those voices as carefully as the missing pages from the station log. She could no longer believe either discovery was an accident. At sunrise, she packed the folded harbor map, the station log, and the handwritten note into her backpack before walking toward the marina. Only one person had hinted that he knew more about the shack than he was willing to admit. She found Jack Holloway repairing fishing nets beside his weathered boat. He looked up as she approached, immediately recognizing the determination on her face. "You found something," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "You knew there was a room under the shack." Jack tied off another knot before answering. "I knew there used to be one." "Why didn't you tell me?" He sighed heavily. "Because I hoped nobody would ever have to go back down there." Emily placed the folded note from her father on the dock between them. Jack looked at the familiar handwriting, but made no move to touch it. "He wrote this?" Emily said. "It says someone should tell me the truth." Jack stared across the harbor instead of meeting her eyes. Fishing boats drifted gently against the tide, while gulls circled overhead. Finally, he spoke. "Your father never stopped believing the truth would matter someday." "Then tell me." Jack shook his head. "I'm not the one who should." "Why not?" "Because I wasn't there when the decision was made." Emily frowned. "What decision?" Jack gathered his nets into a neat pile before standing. "After the storm, the station was closed. Not long after that, the radio room disappeared behind locked doors." "Who locked it?" Jack hesitated. "Harold Green." Emily recognized the name from old newspaper articles she had skimmed in the library archives. Harold had once managed the Coast Guard station before retiring many years earlier. "Is he still alive?" Jack nodded slowly. "Lives on the north side of town." Emily waited, hoping Jack would continue, but he remained silent. "Why would he lock the room?" she asked. Jack's tired eyes settled on the harbor. "You'll have to ask him yourself." By late morning, Emily stood outside a small white house overlooking the shoreline. Wind chimes swayed gently on the porch as she knocked on the front door. Several moments passed before an elderly man answered. His shoulders were slightly bent with age, but his eyes remained sharp. "Can I help you?" he asked politely. "Are you Harold Green?" "I am." Emily took a careful breath. "My name is Emily Carter." The change in his expression was immediate. His face stiffened almost imperceptibly before he looked away toward the ocean. "Thomas Carter's daughter," he murmured. Emily nodded. "I bought the old Coast Guard shack." Harold remained silent. "I found the radio room." His grip tightened slightly against the edge of the door. "I see." "I need to understand what happened there." Harold looked past her toward the empty road before answering. "There's nothing left to understand. There are missing pages in the station log." No response. "Someone cut part of the radio recording." Still nothing. "My father left me a note asking someone to tell me the truth." Harold closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, sadness had replaced surprise. "Some truths don't become easier with time," he said quietly. "Then why hide them?" Emily asked. "Because sometimes people believe they're protecting others. Were you protecting my father?" Harold looked down at his hands. "No." "Then who?" He shook his head. "I can't answer that." Emily felt frustration rising, but she kept her voice calm. "Did you lock the radio room?" After a long silence, Harold gave a single slow nod. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I was ordered to secure everything inside." "By whom?" "That no longer matters." Emily searched his face. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted, as though he had carried the same burden for years. "The room has been hidden for decades," she said softly. "My father's name has carried blame all that time." Harold's eyes filled with quiet regret. "I know." "Then help me." He remained silent for so long that Emily thought the conversation was over. Finally, he spoke almost in a whisper. "There are things inside that room people were never meant to lose." The words lingered between them. Emily realized he had carefully avoided saying they were never meant to find them. Before she could ask another question, Harold gently stepped back. "I'm sorry, Emily." The door closed softly. She stood on the porch for another minute before turning toward town. Harold had admitted locking the room, but not why. On her walk back to the shack, she replayed every word. One sentence refused to leave her mind. "There are things inside that room people were never meant to lose." Back inside the hidden radio room, Emily looked around with fresh eyes. If Harold had sealed the room without removing everything, perhaps something still remained exactly where it had always been. She slowly examined the large radio console again, running her fingertips along its worn wooden edges. The brass key she had found beneath the storage shelf days earlier rested inside her pocket. Almost absent-mindedly, she removed it and compared it against several locks built into the equipment. None fit. She tried a cabinet beneath the desk. Still nothing. Then she noticed a small keyhole hidden behind a hinged metal panel on the side of the main control console. It had been concealed so carefully beneath years of dust that she had overlooked it entirely. Emily inserted the brass key. It slid smoothly into place. She hesitated only a second before turning it. A quiet metallic click echoed through the room. Somewhere inside the radio console, an old locking mechanism released. A narrow section of wood beside the control panel slowly shifted outward, revealing a hidden compartment that had remained sealed for decades. Emily held her breath as the hidden compartment eased open with a dry wooden scrape. Dust drifted through the beam of her flashlight while the old mechanism settled into place. The compartment was surprisingly deep, built directly into the side of the main radio console where no one would ever notice it without the correct key. For a moment, she simply stared inside. Unlike the rest of the room, everything in the compartment had been carefully protected from moisture. A rubber lining surrounded the narrow space, and its contents had been wrapped in oilcloth before being stored away. Whoever had hidden them had expected them to survive for many years. Emily gently lifted out the first bundle and laid it across the desk. It contained several folders tied together with faded string. The paper had yellowed with age but remained remarkably well preserved. The top folder bore an official Coast Guard stamp and the words, "Original Rescue Reports." Her pulse quickened. She untied the string and opened the folder. Inside were handwritten incident reports documenting the storm she had already read about in newspaper archives. Unlike the published accounts, these reports contained detailed timelines, radio logs, weather observations, and signatures from officers involved in the rescue. Emily immediately noticed something important. The times matched the entries still remaining in her father's station log. There was no unexplained delay where the newspaper claimed one had occurred. Instead, every recorded transmission followed one another in a clear sequence. She carefully compared several pages with the harbor map spread across the desk. The coordinates matched as well. Her father had accurately recorded distress calls exactly where the map indicated. She turned another page and found a typed list titled Recovered Survivors. Beneath it appeared the names of every fisherman rescued during the storm. Several had handwritten notes beside them, confirming when and where each person had been located. Emily counted the names twice. More people had survived than the newspaper articles had ever mentioned. Someone had simplified the story after the fact. She continued reading. The next folder contained copies of internal communication between rescue stations. Some pages discussed damaged equipment, worsening weather, and overloaded radio traffic. None blamed her father, if anything. Several reports praised the steady communication maintained from Station 12 despite deteriorating conditions. Emily leaned back in the chair, trying to absorb what she was seeing. For years, the town had quietly accepted that Thomas Carter had somehow failed during the rescue. Yet the original reports, hidden inside this compartment, painted an entirely different picture. She remembered the calm confidence in his recorded voice. Nothing about these documents suggested panic or negligence. Quite the opposite. She carefully placed the reports into neat piles before reaching for the second bundle. This one contained smaller notebooks, each labeled by month and year. They appeared to be working journals kept by radio operators. Most contained routine observations, maintenance notes, and weather updates. Near the bottom of the stack, she found another notebook written almost entirely in her father's familiar handwriting. Unlike the official station log upstairs on the desk, this journal included personal observations alongside daily duties. Emily read quietly. Some entries described long overnight shifts, equipment repairs, and concern for local fishermen who ignored storm warnings too often. Others mentioned ordinary moments. A strong cup of coffee before sunrise, a family of seabirds nesting near the cliffs, the pride he felt watching young volunteers learn emergency procedures. She smiled softly. These pages reminded her of the father she had known at home, rather than the mysterious figure described by town rumors. As she continued reading, one entry caught her attention. Written only days before the storm, her father noted that radio inspections had revealed recurring electrical problems during severe weather. He also mentioned filing multiple maintenance requests. Emily searched through the remaining pages. Several requests had been acknowledged but never completed before the rescue operation. She frowned. The information explained why communications had become difficult during the storm, but it still did not explain why the official story blamed her father instead. Closing the journal carefully, she reached for the final package hidden inside the compartment. It contained a large, sealed envelope addressed only with one word written neatly across the front. Emily. Her hands stopped moving. She stared at her own name for several silent seconds. The envelope looked newer than everything else in the compartment, as though it had been placed there shortly before the room was sealed. She traced the letters with her fingertips, recognizing the careful handwriting immediately. Her father had written it. Unlike the small note she had received after his funeral, this envelope felt heavier. Whatever lay inside had been intentionally hidden where only someone with the brass key could eventually reach it. Emily looked around the quiet radio room. The old equipment remained silent except for the occasional ticking of cooling metal. Dust floated lazily through the narrow beam of her flashlight. Every discovery over the past several days had brought her closer to understanding what happened inside this forgotten station. Yet each answer had only deepened her determination to continue. She carefully lifted the envelope from the compartment and held it against her chest for a moment. It was the first letter her father had ever written directly to her. She resisted the urge to tear it open immediately. Instead, she gathered the rescue reports, journals, and survivor lists back into their protective wrapping. After everything she had already found, the hidden room, the altered station log, the missing recording, and the preserved official files, she refused to risk damaging the evidence through carelessness. Only when every document had been safely arranged on the desk did she return her attention to the envelope. Her name remained there in the familiar handwriting she had missed for so many years. With trembling fingers, Emily slowly broke the aging seal. Emily unfolded the letter with extraordinary care, afraid that the brittle paper might tear beneath her fingers. For several moments, she simply stared at the first line without reading further. Seeing her name written by her father's hand made the years between his death and this moment disappear. Finally, she took a slow breath and began. My dear Emily, if you're reading this, then you found the room I always hoped would survive long enough for you to see it. I never wanted you to carry the weight of rumors without knowing who I truly was. Tears blurred the page, but she wiped them away before continuing. Her father never claimed to be a hero. Instead, he wrote about responsibility. He explained how every radio operator understood that voices traveling across the ocean often represented someone's last hope. During storms, every transmission mattered, because a single missed coordinate could mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. Emily smiled sadly. Those words sounded exactly like the quiet lessons he had taught her as a little girl whenever they watched fishing boats disappear beyond the horizon. The letter continued with memories instead of explanations. He wrote about bringing her to the shack when she was too young to remember, letting her wear oversized headphones while pretending to answer imaginary calls from passing ships. He described the way she laughed whenever the old radio crackled unexpectedly. Reading those forgotten moments filled the silent room with warmth despite the cold concrete walls surrounding her. Then the tone of the letter changed. There may come a day when people finally ask what really happened during the storm. If that day arrives, don't answer with anger. Let the record speak louder than grief. Truth doesn't need revenge. It only needs someone willing to protect it. Emily lowered the page for a moment. She thought about the missing logbook pages, the cut tape recording, and the official reports preserved inside the hidden compartment. Her father had never asked her to fight anyone. He had only asked her to let the truth survive. She carefully finished the letter. Near the end, he wrote that no matter what others believed, he had always trusted that Emily would choose kindness over bitterness. His final sentence simply read, "I'm proud to be your father." Emily closed her eyes as tears rolled silently down her face. For the first time since his funeral, the ache of losing him felt joined by something else. Peace. She folded the letter and slipped it into the same pocket where she still carried his note about the $100. Together, the two messages seemed to complete one another. One had helped her survive after losing everything. The other reminded her why survival alone was never the end of the story. Late that afternoon, she climbed out of the radio room carrying only copies of several reports and the folded letter. The original documents remained carefully protected inside the hidden compartment. She locked it again with the brass key before walking toward the north side of town. Harold Green answered the door more quickly this time. His tired eyes immediately settled on the envelope in Emily's hand. "You found it," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "I read his letter." Harold stepped onto the porch without speaking. The ocean stretched behind them beneath a pale evening sky. Emily looked directly at him. "He never blamed anyone." Harold closed his eyes for a moment. "That was the hardest part." She handed him one of the copied rescue reports. "These are the original records." He accepted the pages with trembling hands. His gaze moved slowly across the familiar signatures and weather reports before stopping at Thomas Carter's name. "I haven't seen these in years," he whispered. "Then you know what they prove?" Harold remained silent. Emily waited patiently. Finally, he spoke. "After the storm, people wanted quick answers. There had been lives lost, boats destroyed, families demanding explanations. He looked toward the distant harbor. The equipment failures reflected badly on the station. Investigations were already beginning. Emily listened without interrupting. The radio room contained everything, Harold continued. Logs, recordings, maintenance reports. If everything became public immediately, careers would end before anyone understood what had happened. So you locked the room? He nodded slowly. I was told to secure every record until the review was complete. He paused, his voice growing quieter. The review never truly happened. Emily studied his face. The regret she had noticed before no longer seemed hidden. It had become impossible for him to disguise. You could have opened the room later, she said gently. Harold looked down at the papers in his hands. Every year it became harder. People accepted the official version. Your father never defended himself. Eventually, I convinced myself reopening everything would only reopen old wounds. Emily thought about the years her father had lived with those rumors. She wondered whether he had expected this silence all along. He left everything so someone could find it, she said. Harold nodded, unable to deny it. He believed the truth deserved its chance. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Wind rustled the trees lining the quiet street, while distant gulls called above the harbor. Finally, Harold looked at Emily with renewed determination. I've been carrying this for far too long. Then help me finish it. He took a slow breath before answering. I will. Emily thanked him quietly before gathering the copied reports. As she began walking back toward the harbor, Harold called after her. She turned. When you're ready, he said. The town deserves to hear the whole story. Emily looked down at the folder in her hands, then toward the old Coast Guard shack standing alone against the shoreline. She knew what had to come next. She would place every surviving record, every report, every journal, every map, and every remaining piece of evidence before the community that had believed the wrong story for decades. This time, nothing would remain hidden. The meeting hall overlooking the harbor had not been this full in years. Folding chairs filled every aisle and people stood along the walls, speaking quietly while waiting for the evening meeting to begin. Fishermen who had survived the great storm sat beside younger families who only knew the story through newspaper articles and local rumors. Emily stood near the front of the room with a small wooden box resting on the table before her. Inside were copies of the station log, the original rescue reports, the harbor map, her father's journal, and the letter she had chosen to keep private. Nora Benson stood nearby, helping organize the documents into neat stacks. Deputy Ryan Mills checked the room one final time before walking toward Emily. Everyone's here, he said gently. Whenever you're ready. Emily looked across the crowd. Many faces were unfamiliar. Others she recognized from passing on quiet streets since arriving in town. Some looked curious. Others looked doubtful. A few simply looked tired. She understood why. The story they believed had remained unchanged for decades. Changing it would not be easy. Harold Green entered quietly through a side door. Conversations faded almost immediately as people noticed him. He walked slowly to the front of the room before taking a seat beside Emily without saying a word. His presence alone seemed to surprise many in the audience. Ryan stepped forward. Thank you all for coming. Miss Emily Carter has asked that several historical records concerning the old Coast Guard station be presented publicly. These records have also been reviewed alongside archived county files. He nodded toward Emily. The floor is yours. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she looked across the room. Then she remembered the final words in her father's letter. Truth doesn't need revenge. It only needs someone willing to protect it. She unfolded the first document. Most of you knew my father only through the official reports after the storm, she began quietly. I believed those reports too because I had nothing else. She placed the original station log on the table, but hidden inside the old Coast Guard shack were records that had never disappeared. They were simply never seen. Nora distributed copies of several pages to the people sitting in the front rows, while others followed along using enlarged photographs displayed beside the table. Emily explained the sequence of events exactly as recorded. The remaining pages from the station log showed continuous radio communication before and after the missing section. The harbor map marked the final distress signal exactly where the original reports confirmed it had been received. The survivor list documented every fisherman rescued during the operation. Nothing in those original records supported the accusation that Thomas Carter had delayed communications. Instead, every surviving report described organized radio traffic despite failing equipment and worsening weather. Murmurs spread through the audience as people quietly compared the documents. One elderly fisherman slowly stood. "I was on one of those boats," he said. His voice carried the weight of many years. "I remember hearing that station operator stay with us on the radio almost until the end." The room grew silent. Emily carefully placed another document beside the first. The official newspaper articles stated communications broke down because my father remained at his station too long. She looked toward the audience. The original maintenance reports tell a different story. Nora handed additional copies forward. The reports documented repeated electrical failures inside the aging radio equipment days before the storm. Repair requests had been submitted but never completed. Several people quietly exchanged surprised glances. Deputy Ryan stepped beside the table holding another folder. County archives confirmed these maintenance requests were properly filed before the rescue operation. His statement carried obvious authority. The copies presented tonight match preserved county records. Emily reached toward the old reel-to-reel recorder she had carefully transported from the shack earlier that afternoon. The machine rested on a separate table connected to portable speakers. She looked briefly toward Harold. He gave a small, silent nod. Emily pressed the play button. Static filled the room before familiar voices emerged through the speakers. Weather reports, vessel locations, rescue coordination. Finally, Thomas Carter's calm voice echoed throughout the hall. Several older residents lowered their heads as they listened. His instructions remained steady despite increasing urgency. Emily stopped the recording just before the section where the tape had been cut years earlier. "This recording was deliberately altered," she explained. "The missing portion no longer exists, but everything that remains supports the written reports rather than the published accusations." Silence settled across the room once again. Then Harold Green slowly rose from his chair. Every eye turned toward him. He stood quietly for several seconds before speaking. "I was station manager." His voice was older now, softer than the authority he once carried. "After the storm, I ordered the radio room secured." He paused. "The records presented here tonight are authentic." Several people shifted uneasily. Harold continued. "Equipment failures complicated the rescue long before that storm reached shore. Thomas Carter remained at his station because fishermen were still calling for help. He followed his duty." His voice grew heavier. "The room should never have remained sealed. That decision became my responsibility, and I have carried it ever since." No one interrupted him. There was no anger in the room now, only quiet reflection. Ryan stepped forward once more, holding a county archive folder. Following review of these original records and surviving county documentation, there is no evidence supporting previous claims that Thomas Carter failed in his responsibilities during the rescue. He closed the folder gently. "Those conclusions should never have become part of this town's history." Emily looked around the room. Several older fishermen nodded silently. Others wiped away tears without embarrassment. Years of misunderstanding seemed to loosen all at once. not through dramatic speeches, but through patient evidence placed before people willing to see it. When the meeting finally ended, many residents approached Emily one by one. Some thanked her. These apologized for things they had believed without ever questioning them. She accepted every word quietly, knowing none of them could change the years her father had lived beneath undeserved suspicion. But they could change how he would now be remembered. As the hall gradually emptied, Emily gathered the documents back into their wooden box. Harold paused beside her before leaving. "There's one thing left," he said softly. Emily looked toward the distant shoreline visible through the hall's windows, far beyond the harbor lights. The old Coast Guard shack stood alone against the darkening sea. The hidden radio room beneath it had remained silent for decades. Tomorrow, for the first time since its doors had been sealed, it would be opened again, not as a forgotten secret, but as a place where the truth had finally found its way home. The first Saturday after the town meeting dawned clear and bright. The kind of morning that made the Atlantic sparkle beneath the rising sun. Emily stood outside the old Coast Guard shack, holding the same brass key that had once opened only hidden doors. Around her, volunteers unloaded fresh lumber, buckets of paint, new windows, and boxes of donated supplies from pickup trucks lining the narrow coastal road. Fishermen who had survived the great storm worked beside high school students who had only recently learned the true story behind the forgotten station. No one had been asked to come. They had simply arrived. Jack Holloway smiled as he handed Emily a paintbrush. "Looks different already." She looked at the weathered building. Weeks earlier, she had seen only peeling paint, broken windows, and collapsing floorboards. Now she saw people laughing together while replacing rotten steps, repairing the porch, and clearing years of overgrown brush. "It does," she replied softly. Jack nodded toward the crowd. "Funny thing about the truth." Emily smiled. "What's that?" "Sometimes it fixes more than the thing that was broken." Throughout the day, the shack slowly came back to life. Nora Benson organized old photographs and copied documents inside display cases donated by the library. Deputy Ryan Mills helped install protective lighting around the building, while county workers inspected the foundation and declared it safe to preserve. Harold Green arrived quietly carrying a small wooden box. He approached Emily after most of the volunteers had gathered for lunch. "These belonged here," he said. Emily opened the box carefully. Inside rested her father's Coast Guard nameplate, an old brass microphone badge, several station patches, and the original station clock that had once hung inside the radio room. Harold looked toward the restored entrance. "I should have returned them years ago." Emily gently lifted the nameplate engraved with Senior Radio Operator Thomas Carter. "Thank you," she said. Harold nodded, emotion briefly crossing his face before he quietly joined the others repairing the front fence. By early afternoon, the hidden radio room was ready. Emily unlocked the compartment beneath the floor one final time before carefully opening the old hatch. This time the staircase was brightly lit. Fresh air drifted into the room for the first time in decades, as volunteers carried away damaged materials while preserving every original piece of equipment. The radio console remained exactly where it had always stood. The station log rested inside a protective display case beside the harbor map, the survivor lists, and copies of the original rescue reports. The missing pages and cut recording were never replaced because they could not be. Instead, a small plaque explained that history sometimes survives through what remains rather than what disappears. Visitors walked quietly through the room, reading each display with respectful silence. Some paused before the old reel-to-reel recorder. Others stood before the framed photograph of the Coast Guard crew outside the station, now cleaned and restored. Nearly everyone stopped for a moment beside Thomas Carter's nameplate. Later that afternoon, several local school teachers approached Emily with an unexpected request. "Would you consider opening this place to students?" one asked. "The children should know this history." Emily looked around the room before answering. "I'd like that." The following weeks passed quickly. Every Friday morning, a small group of students visited the restored station. Emily welcomed each class personally. She showed them the weather maps, explained how radio operators once guided rescue crews through dangerous storms, and reminded them that courage often looked quiet rather than dramatic. She never exaggerated her father's story. She simply shared the records exactly as they had survived. The children always asked about the hidden room. Emily smiled every time she opened the hatch. "History isn't only what people remember," she would tell them. "Sometimes it's what people choose to protect." Nora continued volunteering at the small museum several afternoons each week, helping organize donated photographs from retired fishermen. Jack often sat on the porch, sharing stories with visitors who remembered the old station before it closed. Harold returned several times as well. At first, he came only to help identify equipment or answer questions about daily operations. Eventually, he began speaking openly about the mistakes that had allowed the truth to remain hidden for so long. Each visit seemed to lighten a burden he had carried for decades. Even Linda Carter came one quiet afternoon. She stood outside the shack for several minutes before approaching Emily. Neither of them spoke immediately. Finally, Linda looked toward the restored building. "Your father would have been proud." Emily studied her carefully. The bitterness that had once defined Linda seemed replaced by something quieter. Regret, perhaps. Emily simply nodded. "I think he would have wanted people to remember everyone who worked here." Linda whispered a soft apology before leaving. Emily watched her disappear down the coastal road without anger. Some wounds healed through conversation, others healed through simple understanding. Autumn slowly arrived along the shoreline one evening after the final visitors had gone home. Emily remained alone inside the radio room. The restored equipment surrounded her exactly as it had surrounded her father years earlier. She placed his two handwritten notes side by side on the desk. The first had given a frightened 15-year-old girl $100 and hope enough to survive. The second had trusted that same girl to protect the truth without hatred. She folded both notes carefully before placing them inside a small archival folder reserved only for family items. Then she reached toward the restored radio console. With help from local volunteers, one receiver had been repaired well enough to power on safely. Emily switched it on. The familiar hum filled the quiet room. Static drifted softly through the speaker before fading into the distant rhythm of waves striking the shore above. She closed her eyes and listened. Years earlier, she had entered this room searching for answers about the father she thought she had lost to history. Instead, she had found something much greater. She had found the quiet strength of a man who never demanded recognition, the courage to let evidence speak instead of anger, and a community willing to admit that even old mistakes could be corrected when truth finally emerged. Emily climbed the staircase and stepped outside just as the sun settled beyond the Atlantic. The restored Coast Guard shack stood proudly against the golden horizon, no longer forgotten, no longer abandoned. A small bronze sign near the entrance caught the final light of day. It read, "Thomas Carter Memorial Radio Station, dedicated to those who answered every call for help." Emily locked the front door, slipped the old brass key into her pocket, and looked out across the endless water. Somewhere beyond the horizon, ships still crossed the same sea her father had once watched over. The wind carried a faint whisper through the restored radio antenna above the roof, blending with the steady sound of the waves below. Emily smiled, turned toward the path home, and walked forward knowing that while voices may fade, kindness, courage, and truth always find a way to be heard again.